We come together, put partisanship aside, and say we're going to solve the problems in front of this country. We can do it. The brain power is here. The capability is here. Let's do it. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
The Assistant Majority Leader is recognized.
How much time is remaining on each side?
Democratic side has 18 minutes remaining.
Is there any time remaining on the other side?
There is no other time on the other side.
I'd like to ask the chairman if I could have 8 minutes or 10 minutes to speak.
Mr. President, I yield 10 minutes to the Senator from Illinois.
I thank the chairman of the committee and my friend from Utah, the ranking member of the Senate Finance Committee. Senator Coburn of Oklahoma, who just spoke, is someone that probably we see things, so many things differently, but yet we see many things the same. He and I come to the Senate with different backgrounds, perhaps different political values in many areas, and a much different voting record. They would put us on opposite sides of the political spectrum if they described those voting records. And yet I found over the last several years that Senator Coburn and I have been able to agree and come together on some of the important issues which he just raised on the Republican side of the aisle, which are shared on the Democratic side of the aisle. Senator Coburn and I served on the Bowles-Simpson Commission, a commission appointed by President Obama to reduce our nation's debt and deficit. I voted for the commission report with some misgiving over proposals, but believe that it moved us in the right, proper, and necessary direction. The fact and simple fact of the matter is the United States borrows 40 cents for every dollar our government spends. Borrows 40 cents for every dollar we spend, primarily after we've exhausted the savings of Americans from foreign nations like China, who end up buying the U.S. Treasuries to fund our debt. So as we go more deeply into debt, we become more indebted to foreign countries, sovereign nations, and their sovereign funds. I think that that is something that needs to be addressed in a proper fashion. Where Senator Coburn and I may disagree is in the fashion that we approach it. We are currently emerging from a recession. We know what the impact has been. Families and businesses across America have been hard hit. Families and their savings, many people losing their jobs and businesses, either going out of business or cutting back. We're starting to see the first indications of recovery, the green shoots, as they say. As the President said in his State of the Union address, we lost 4 million jobs in America in the 6 months before he was sworn in, and another 4 million before his proposal to get the economy moving forward was enacted into law. 8 million jobs in that short time frame out of the 14 million unemployed today. The President really started to move the economy forward, working off of a proposal by President Bush to deal with financial institutions, a bitter pill for many of us, but I'm afraid necessary to keep our economy stable, and then with his investment program to put America back to work. These things are starting to take hold. We've seen a growth of some 3 million private sector jobs since the President's program started. It's an indication that we're moving in the right direction. And I would just say to my friend from Oklahoma, when we talk about issues like deficit reduction and spending reduction, we should speak to those issues in the context of economic recovery to make certain that whatever decisions we make in reducing the deficit, reducing spending, raising taxes, whatever it may be, that at this point in time in our history, it's in the context of getting America back to work. Now, at 12 o'clock today, we have a scheduled vote, and the vote is on the debt ceiling. What is the debt ceiling? It goes back to my earlier point. When we spend more than we bring in revenue, we need to borrow it. And as the need to borrow increases, the President has a responsibility to ask for authorization from Congress. It's known as the debt ceiling limit. In years gone by, it was a routine vote. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, President Reagan asked for some 16 debt ceiling extensions in the 8 years that he served. And for most of these, he was given permission to extend the debt ceiling on a bipartisan vote. 16 times in 8 years. A rather common occurrence at that time, but one that we anticipated being part of the ordinary business of government. That issue has become politicized now, and there are some members who will come to the floor and vote against extending the debt ceiling, extending the authority of the president to borrow money to keep our government functioning. What troubles me greatly is many of the same senators who are going to vote against the debt ceiling voted for the spending. They voted to spend the money knowing we didn't have it, and now, as former Congressman Obey of Wisconsin used to say, want to pose for holy pictures. Oh, I'm opposed to the debt ceiling. I'm not in favor of debt. Really? Well, how about your vote for the appropriations bills to fund our wars? Didn't you vote for those? Didn't you vote for the budget resolution which passed on a bipartisan basis that established our spending for 2 years? Didn't you vote as well when it came to the continuing resolution of appropriations? It had to pass both the House and the Senate. Many of my colleagues who dutifully voted for all of this spending, knowing in the back of their minds we didn't have enough money and would have to borrow to accomplish it, now come to the floor in a few moments and are going to say, we are holier than the others, we are going to vote against an extension of the debt ceiling. I would say to those colleagues, don't vote for the spending if you won't vote for the borrowing, because we know now they are linked together. They are one and the same. And the President is only doing what is responsible. You know, we faced a government shutdown over this debt ceiling last year. It's one of the first ever, where a serious threat was looming that we were not going to extend the debt ceiling and, in fact, would renege or basically default on America's debts around the world. The result of that would have been catastrophic. The reputation of America, its economy, and the soundness of the dollar were at stake. Thank goodness at the last minute those who were opposing the debt ceiling relented, and they set up the process, which we will be addressing in just a few moments. They said, well, on a periodic basis then, the Congress will have to vote to extend the debt ceiling. Last week, the House of Representatives said, no, we don't want to extend the debt ceiling. The same members of the House who voted for the spending bill, the same members who voted for the Budget Enforcement Act, the same members who give speeches back home about how we can't turn our backs on our men and women in uniform and have to spend the money to bring them home safely, those same members voted against the debt ceiling. It is a totally inconsistent position. It is not honest. An honest position would be, I don't vote for spending, I don't vote for borrowing. Very few senators, if any, can say that with a straight face. In fact, just the opposite is true. I hope my colleagues here will accept our responsibility to extend the debt ceiling by voting no on the motion to proceed to the consideration of the debt ceiling. It's an important vote. And then I want to join and meet the challenge of Senator Coburn of Oklahoma. There are things we can and must do to bring our nation's debt down, consistent with the Bowles-Simpson Deficit Commission, consistent with the work of the Gang of Six, and consistent with growing the American economy. It has to include, as Bowles-Simpson Commission recommended, both revenue increases as well as spending cuts. Both have to happen. When the President comes before us in the State of the Union and suggests increasing tax rates of those making over $1 million a year, the vast majority of Americans say that's reasonable. It's reasonable to ask those who are well off to pay their fair share. Well, let's make that part of our conversation here. If we are serious about the deficit, let us include revenue that will not hurt working families struggling from paycheck to paycheck, but will bring the money in to lessen our need to borrow money from overseas. That should be part of it, spending cuts and revenue enhancements that will not hurt the economy. I think we can do that if we address it on a bipartisan basis. I stand ready to cooperate with my colleagues to achieve that. I hope they'll join me in voting no against the motion to proceed and yield the floor.
President.
The senior senator from Montana is recognized.
President, on a totally different matter, this for about 2 minutes, I want to compliment the senior senator from Kentucky for his long-time work on behalf of the dissidents in Burma. Very recently visited Burma. He spoke on the floor about 3 hours ago. He met Aung San Suu Kyi, who recently won a Nobel Prize. And we, as Americans, as American country, are making real progress in Burma. Our sanctions in Burma are working. The government there is relenting, and discussions that I've had with the State Department, the hope is that we keep our sanctions for the time being so that we can continue our progress in Burma. But we are making progress in Burma. Dissidents, as led by Aung San Suu Kyi, are very effective. But again, I want to compliment the Senator from Kentucky for his 20 years of work in this area. And I think it's partly because of his efforts that we're making progress in Burma. Mr. President, turning back to the subject at hand, Alexander Hamilton once said, "To be able to borrow upon good terms, it is essential that the credit of a nation should be well established." That's obvious. We have low interest rates today because so far we've been able to borrow on good terms. The good terms are the American people and investors worldwide know the United States is a safe haven, given all the perplexity that's occurring in the world, all the consternation occurring in the world, the problems in Europe, for example, and some other countries. The United States is a safe haven. Investors want to borrow in the United States Treasuries. That's why the rate is so low, one of the lowest times in recent history, and that's essentially because our credit is good. Investors trust the United States. Now, it's important to also remember, Mr. President, that this debt limit is not an authorization that we're voting on today is not an authorization for new spending. I repeat, it does not authorize new spending. That's not what it is. It has nothing to do with new spending. It just says that we've got to honor our past bills. We have to honor our past debts. And as Alexander Hamilton said, for our country to be on good terms, it is important that we honor our past debts, or as he said it, the credit of the nation should be well established. I strongly urge our colleagues to vote no against this motion to proceed to disapprove, because the result would be chaos. If that were to pass, it'd be chaos. We'd plunge ourselves back into recession, probably through that into a depression. Interest rates would skyrocket. Inflation would skyrocket. And we're trying to lower unemployment rates, Mr. President, and not increase unemployment rates. We want people to have jobs, not people not to have jobs. If the United States were not to honor its bills, if the United States were not honor the debt that it has heretofore incurred, it would cause chaos. It would show we're not a credit-worthy country. And for that reason, I think it's a no-brainer, Mr. President, that this bill should be disapproved, and frankly should be unanimously disapproved, because I think every member of the United States Senate wants to honor the credit of the United States of America, wants to pay the bills we've incurred in the past. It's an entirely different question is what we do in the future. Entirely different question is how much we reduce our debt. Entirely different question is how much we cut spending, reduce and increase revenue in order to reduce our deficits and our debt. That is an entirely different issue. Extremely important issue, but entirely different. It has nothing what to do with this vote. This vote is only whether we honor our past debts. Once we say, yes, we're going to honor our past debts, then, Mr. President, clearly it's imperative that this body move ahead to reduce deficits, reduce our national debt. There's been a lot of discussion about that. We've not made much headway as we should. But it's important to remember, on August of last year, this Congress voted to reduce spending by $2 trillion, $2 trillion, to reduce spending. Reduce spending by $2.1 trillion over 10 years. About close to $1 trillion of that was accomplished on that vote, and the other 1.2 is part of the sequestration, which goes into effect in January next year. But it is not unimportant that this body voted to reduce spending by about $2 trillion. So we should honor our past debts. We should reduce spending. We should not reduce spending. We should reduce our budget debts and deficit. We do that by cutting spending and raising revenue. But that's a different issue. That's what we do in the future. That's what we have to work on this year and next year. But today, it's important for the world to know that we honor our commitments. The United States can be trusted. We have a credit that's well established because we honor our past obligations. Mr. President, I yield the floor. In so doing, I strongly urge members of the Senate to vote no on the motion to proceed to disapprove, because I think that if that would be a positive outcome, if that vote were to pass, I'm not one that's prone to exaggeration or to hyperbole, but I might say in this case, if this motion were to proceed, we'd be on the border of catastrophe. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senior senator from Utah is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. I ask unanimous consent that my final remarks be placed in the record at this point.
Without objection, so ordered.
I ask for the ayes and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The yeas and nays are ordered.
Time.
All time is yielded back under the previous order. The quorum occurs. The question occurs on the motion to proceed to H.J. Resolution 98. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka, Mr. Alexander, Ms. Ayat, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Baucus, Mr. Begich, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Bingaman, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Boxer, Mr. Brown of Massachusetts, Mr. Brown of Ohio, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Chambliss, Mr. Coates, Mr. Coburn, Mr. Cochran, Ms. Collins, Mr. Conrad, Mr. Coons,
Where are you going?
Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Dement, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Feinstein, Mr. Franken, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heller, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hutchison, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Inoue, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Kerry, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Cole, Mr. Kyle, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Lautenberg, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Lieberman, Mr. Lugar, Mr. Manchin, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson of Nebraska, Mr. Nelson of Florida, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada. Mr. Risch. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Rockefeller. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Sessions. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Ms. Snow. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Udall of Colorado. Mr. Udall of New Mexico. Mr. Vetter. Mr. Warner. Mr. Webb. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Alexander, Crapo, Enzi, Hatch, Hutchison, Isaacson, and McConnell. Senators voting in the negative: Akaka, Baucus, Bingaman, Boxer, Brown of Ohio, and Merkley. Mr. Vitter, aye. Mrs. Hagan, no. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett, no. Mr. Franken. Mr. Franken, no. Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown of Massachusetts, no. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Grassley, aye. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sanders, no. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Schumer, no. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Cornyn, aye. Mr. Rockefeller. Mr. Rockefeller, no. Mr. Udall of New Mexico, no. Ms. Ayotte. Ms. Ayotte, aye. Mr. Casey. Mr. Casey, no. Mr. Lugar. Mr. Lugar, aye. Mrs. Murray. Mrs. Murray, no. Mr. Nelson. Mr. Nelson of Nebraska, aye. Mr. Manchin, aye. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, no. Mr. Inouye, no. Mr. Kyle. Mr. Kyle, aye. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Whitehouse, no. Mr. Pryor. Mr. Pryor, no. Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed of Nevada, aye. Mr. Webb. Mr. Webb, no. Mr. Reed of Nevada, no. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, no. Mr. Tester, no. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lee, aye. Mr. Inhofe, aye. Mr. Begich. Mr. Begich, no. Mr. Conrad. Mr. Conrad. No. Mr. Coons. Mr. Coons. No. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, aye. Mr. Risch. Mr. Risch, aye. Ms. Cantwell. Ms. Cantwell, no. Mr. Burr. Mr. Burr, aye. Mr. Cochran. Mr. Cochran, aye. Ms. Collins. Ms. Collins, aye. Mr. Cole, no. Ms. Mikulski. Ms. Mikulski, no. Mr. Rubio, aye. Mr. Blunt, aye. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Wyden, no. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Roberts, aye. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Harkin, no. Mr. Nelson. Mr. Nelson of Florida, no. Mr. Coburn, aye. Klobuchar. Ms. Klobuchar, no. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wicker, aye. Mr. Sessions. Mrs. McCaskill, no. Mr. Graham. Mr. Graham, aye. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Mr. Portman. Mr. Portman, aye. Mr. Sessions. Mr. Sessions, aye. Mr. Kerry. Mr. Kerry, no. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blumenthal, no. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mrs. Gillibrand, no. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Cardin, no. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warner, no. Stabenow. Ms. Stabenow, no. Mr. Johans, aye. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Toomey, aye. Mr. Lautenberg. Mr. Lautenberg, no. Mr. Lieberman. Mr. Lieberman, no. Mr. Moran. Mr. Moran, aye. Mrs. Shaheen. Mrs. Shaheen, no. Mr. Paul. Mr. Paul, aye. Mr. Levin. Mr. Levin, no. Mr. Dement. Aye. Mr. Dement, aye. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Ms. Snow. Ms. Snow, aye. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Barrasso, aye. Mr. Udall. Mr. Udall of Colorado, no. Mr. Carper, no. Ms. Landrieu, no. Mr. Thune. Mr. Thune, aye. Mr. Coates. Mr. Coates, aye. Mr. Shelby, aye. Mrs. Feinstein.
I don't see you guys. Thank you.
Mrs. Feinstein, no. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Menendez, no. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Leahy, no. Mr. Heller. Mr. Heller, aye. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Durbin, no. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Hoven, aye.
What's the count? Are there any senators in the chamber wishing to vote or to change their vote? Seeing none, the motion to proceed to consider to HJ Resolution 98. The vote is 44 yeas, 52 nays. The motion is not agreed to.
Madam President.
May we have order in the Senate, please? The senator from Montana. The senator from Montana.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to a period of morning business until 5 p.m., with senators permitted to speak for up to 10 minutes each. Further, that the time from 1 to 2 p.m. in the morning and morning business be reserved for the majority.
Without objection.
Thank you. Madam President, I suggest the absence of quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Madam President,
The senator from New Mexico.
I would ask that the quorum call be lifted.
Without objection.
Madam President, I rise today to discuss H.R. 3801, the Ultralight Aircraft Smuggling Prevention Act of 2012, and I urge the Senate to pass this legislation today. Passing this bill will not only help to secure our southwest border, but it also affords us the opportunity to honor an incredible colleague. I had the privilege of serving with Congresswoman Gabby Giffords in the House of Representatives, and she is the force behind this legislation. She originally introduced it in 2010 before the senseless act of violence that took place, and she won its passage. But the Senate failed to take it up. Over this past year, we've been working with Gabby's staff, and I was honored to introduce her bill in the Senate with Senators Heller, Bingaman, and Feinstein. It passed by unanimous consent in December, but was held up in the House because of a procedural issue. This allowed Gabby to reintroduce it in the House this week with Congressman Jeff Flake. And yesterday, as we all bid Gabby an emotional farewell, the House overwhelmingly passed it by a vote of 408-0. I commend the House leadership for working to make sure this important legislation passed as Gabby's final legislative act before resigning. And I want to especially say how honored I am to have worked on this legislation with her. Like all Americans, I've watched in awe at Gabby's courage and her remarkable grace. She inspires us all. She represents the best of our nation. Dr. Martin Luther King once said that darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Gabby is truly a shining light to all who know her. The Ultralight Aircraft Smuggling Prevention Act is a testament to Gabby's commitment to securing our borders from illegal activity. A new trend in drug smuggling is to fly a one-person ultralight aircraft over the border to drop drugs. Hundreds are flown across the southwest border each year. Each one can carry hundreds of pounds of narcotics. Because ultralights are not categorized under existing law as aircraft by the Federal Aviation Administration, they do not fall under the provisions of the Tariff Act of 1930. This means that a drug smuggler piloting an ultralight is subject to weaker criminal penalties than one who uses a small plane. Ultralight present a unique challenge for Border Patrol and prosecutors. Our legislation will close any unintended loopholes. It will give our law enforcement and prosecutors the additional tools they need to combat drug smuggling. It will also add an attempt and conspiracy provision to the aviation smuggling law. This enables prosecutors to charge people other than the pilot who are involved in aviation smuggling. It gives prosecutors a new tool to go after the ground crews who aid pilots, as well as those who pick up drugs that are being dropped off in the United States. This bill will also direct the Department of Defense, the Department of Homeland Security, to establish and collaborate in identifying the equipment and technology for border protection to detect ultralights. The ultimate purpose of this legislation is to make our communities safer. And it is fitting that Gabby, from the very beginning, has been so instrumental in making it happen. I also want to acknowledge the hard work of her staff, who has worked on this bill tirelessly every day. Peter Ambler is one of her staff members that's been key in this. Gabby's staff, I know, is very dedicated to her, and I know that Gabby's perseverance to advance her legislative priorities during her recovery demonstrate what a good public servant she is. Gabby, we know you'll be back, but until then, we wish you and Mark all the very best, and we thank you for your extraordinary service to our nation. Mr. President, I yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll of the Senate.